Today we begin Module 2, focusing on unlearning and undoing colonialism as educators and human beings. Integrating and decolonizing Indigenous perspectives, Module 2. Unlearning and undoing colonialism as an educator and human being, brought to you by Sarah DeWard, Surrey Jeppesen, Tiffany Alexandra Massiana Kelly, and Elder Eileen Beaver. This module brings together voices committed to decolonizing education. Let's take a moment to ground ourselves. As we begin, we honor the land itself and the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded it since time immemorial. Take time to learn and say the names of the nations who have cared for the land where you are located today. In much of Ontario, you'll find yourself on Anishinaabe land. In the east, it could be Haudenosaunee land, while today's Western Ontario is Michif. Along the northern shores, you may sit on Cree land. These are such unique peoples and cultures who had and have a relationship with the particular geography, plants, and animals of that area. The large place called Ontario is intimately known by several nations. Now imagine the incredible, seemingly microscopic depths of knowledge of the land that exists across the boundaries of Canada, and then Turtle Island. We honor the intimate relationship with each hill and valley, the gentle, quiet relationship with the lakes and the life they provide. If you can, look outside right now. Notice that particular tree today, whether its leaves are hidden inside springtime buds or waiting patiently through the cold winter. I invite you to keep noticing that small piece of land. Is it the same tomorrow, or the week after, and month after? This is deep, steady rhythm of the land connects us to each other, and to those who have inhabited and those who will inhabit this land. Take a moment to reflect on the land and its stewards where you are today. Welcome to this sensitivity module on integrating and decolonizing Indigenous perspectives. Before we dive in, we want to take a moment to set the stage for what's ahead. This session will continue to touch on important topics about the histories, cultures, and experiences of Indigenous peoples, and we recognize that some of these discussions may be challenging or emotional. Our goal is to create a space where everyone feels comfortable learning and growing together. We encourage you to approach the material with curiosity, openness, and respect, knowing that some of what we cover may invite you to think differently or reflect more deeply on your own views. Please remember that everyone's experience is unique and Indigenous cultures and perspectives are diverse. We ask that you be mindful of language and respectful of the different views shared throughout this session. It's perfectly okay if you feel uncomfortable at times. That's part of the learning process. Support each other through this journey. This training is just the beginning, and we hope it sparks ongoing curiosity and respect for Indigenous peoples beyond today's session. Thanks so much for being here and for committing to this important learning experience. Let's get started with open hearts and minds. Some of this module's information will be familiar to you, and some will be new. Some will resonate in different ways than it had before. Thank you for approaching today's learning with openness. Here is an overview of what we will cover today: implicit bias and unlearning, the legacy of colonialism in education, undoing and reimagining, indigenizing education, and decolonization. These areas will guide our reflection and discussion today. Let's learn about this module's contributors. Sarah DeWard is an entrepreneur, educator, author, and screenwriter of Métis descent. She is in the process of exploring her family's heritage and learning about how it has shaped her life. She's finding it a very enlightening process. Sarah's debut novel, White Lies, won the 2022 ETFO Writers Award for Women, and her second novel, Deafy, was the CBC Books and Indigo Most Anticipated Read. DeWard was an educator for 20 years and has rediscovered her passion for marketing and communications, particularly in writing and content development. She is proud of the kind of mom she is, as well as her personal and professional accomplishments and drive. I'm Saray Jeppesen, a Cree educator with a passion for community-driven responses to local needs. I have worked with Indigenous groups to identify, plan, and respond to local issues for the last decade. I hold a Master's of Education with a focus on Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and how to integrate Indigenous knowledges into existing systems of education and governance. I work to find whole system perspectives and ensure that all voices are heard and respected. Tiffany Alexandra Massiana Kelly is an award-winning Inuk Dene writer, jeweler, and educator from both Kugluktuk, Nunavut, and Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories. She draws deep inspiration from her dual heritage, which is reflected in her culturally grounded children's books. Taught to bead by her grandmother, Kelly recalls learning the importance of precision, care, and tradition, values that continue to guide her art and teaching. Her work merges traditional and modern methods, such as using sublimation printing on hide to create one-of-a-kind earring designs inspired by nature. Alongside her art and writing, Kelly has worked as a teacher and administrator in both Nunavut and the Northwest Territories for over a decade. She currently lives in Fort Smith, NWT, with her husband, 2 sons, and their dog, continuing to be rooted in her northern upbringing and cultural teachings of her grandparents. We honor the diverse expertise and experiences of our contributors as we continue to learn. Here is a word from our elder, Eileen Beaver, to guide our learning today. Bonjour. Module 2 has FSL teachers thinking outside their comfort zone, and I would like to give you a task, if not an idea, to start a project in fostering a welcoming Indigenous environment at your school. Finding resources and volunteers to support this work may seem challenging at first, but it is a start to reconciling with Indigenous groups within your community. This will help encourage students to attend school, to foster pride and dignity in their identity. Firstly, embrace change with an open mind. How can you make a safe learning space for Indigenous students, and all students to attend class with pride? How can you promote interest in learning of Indigenous history, cultural, and language with and through French? How can you include Indigenous culture, both traditional and contemporary pedagogies, within the standards of practice? Secondly, think how it can go beyond your classroom into the hallway, playground, and other classrooms to create a warm, safe, and interesting learning community for all. To acknowledge the Indigenous students and their language, learn to acknowledge the land, acknowledging their numbered treaties, their territory, and singing the anthem. A greeting in an Indigenous language, and a word or phrase of the day for the entire school to use or practice is a very helpful tool. Thirdly, as you challenge other teachers, also encourage your administrators, principals, and counselors to focus on indigenizing the school entrance and strategically design cultural spaces on school grounds to encourage classes to turn to the outdoors for everyone's use. These structures must represent the nations in your area. Lastly, these projects may take years to complete, but when successfully completed, you will have designed a welcoming atmosphere not only for the students, but also a space of inclusive of all community members to partake in learning in a comfortable environment where they can be safe from feeling intimidated or re-traumatized from the effects of residential school days. Rather, the perception of education will be accepted as a learning space they can support by contributing in various ways to encourage students to walk with their 2 eyes open in their 2 worlds. Success begins at home. Begin by identifying and acknowledging the past, work in the present for the future 7 generations. Thank you to Elder Eileen Beaver for these words that inspire us to create meaningful, long-lasting change. Before we begin, we encourage you to be intentional and reflective by undoing and unlearning the subconscious legacy of colonialism in Canadian education. Recognize colonial behaviors and assumptions in ourselves and our systems. Learn from and not about Indigenous teachings. identify practical steps towards decolonizing our FSL classrooms and practices, keep our focus on amplifying Indigenous knowledge and voices for the benefit of all students. To note, in crafting these modules, we have embraced a process that is as intentional as it is collaborative, matching content with thought methodology by inviting diverse voices to contribute to every aspect of the writing. Guided by the wisdom of an elder, our three creators have woven together their unique experiences and perspectives, ensuring that each element of the module is grounded in both personal insight and collective responsibility. This approach not only enriches the content, but also models the kind of inclusive, reflective practice that we hope to inspire in educators. Together, we invite you to join us on a journey of learning, unlearning, and meaningful integration as we continue to build confidence, authenticity, and equity within the FSL classroom. This module may challenge your thinking and beliefs in a lot of ways. This is a good thing that will inevitably enhance your professionalism in this role. Take a moment to pause and reflect on these personal questions. What is something I've always believed about Indigenous peoples? What is something that challenges my beliefs about Indigenous peoples? How do I characterize my behavior management or leadership style in my professional role? You might find it worthwhile to note your responses down so you can come back to them. Take a moment now to write down your reflections. Here is the module overview again as we transition into the first topic, implicit bias and unlearning. Let's define implicit bias, a hidden or unintentional preference for a particular group based on social identity such as race, gender, class, ability, or sexual preference. Keep this definition in mind as we continue. We all have bias. These implicit biases exist in our subconscious and can involuntarily affect the way we think and act. Our brains use prior knowledge or experiences that we may not be aware of to make quick opinions. These mental shortcuts are needed. Our brains process millions of pieces of information per second, but biases can reinforce stereotypes and can lead to prejudice. We need to understand our unconscious biases for a number of reasons. To foster more inclusion and build healthier, more diverse cultures, which ultimately benefits everyone. To do the very same in the classroom, the workplace, and in our own personal endeavors, like social interactions, social media, etc. Take this moment to bring consciousness to a personal, implicit bias you have about Indigenous peoples. This may be seemingly positive or negative. There is no judgment. Pause here to name and reflect on one of your biases. Consider trying to find both a positive and a negative bias that you hold. The legacy of colonialism and the Eurocentric mindset has dominated Canadian views of Indigenous people at an implicit, subconscious level, often portraying Indigenous people as less than worthy and unfit to parent their children. These Euro-Western ideals and values have been embedded within Canadian policy, the justice system, the child welfare system, and were, and are, perpetuated by social workers, administrators, lawyers, government officials, and judges who view their everyday practices to be in the best interests of Indigenous communities. So how do we, as human beings, take steps towards unlearning and undoing said behaviors, beliefs, and often false truths? The first step is in education. We now move into processing the legacy of colonialism in education. Reflect on your own K-12 education. What did you learn about Indigenous peoples, their histories, and cultures? Consider whose perspectives were centered in your education and whose were missing. This reflection can help uncover biases in educational narratives. Think about the stories you read in school. Who were the heroes presented in those stories? What were you told about Indigenous people, European settlers, women, or gender and sexual minorities? Analyzing these narratives can reveal the underlying values and assumptions of your educational experience. Consider how these attitudes have changed over time and how they might shape your current teaching practice. Reflecting on these layered and sometimes contradictory experiences can provide valuable insights into how to create a more inclusive and equitable educational environment. Here we examine how colonialism has shaped Western education systems. These kinds of practices reflect a Western way of thinking that comes from the Enlightenment period, which claims to have the answers to all important questions for everyone, everywhere. While Western ideas about knowledge have led to many positive outcomes, problems arise when they're treated as the only way to live a good or successful life. School systems were eventually used by people in power to push this Western idea of what it means to be human, along with a belief in constant progress. As a result, school curricula and teaching methods often promote these values while ignoring or rejecting other ways of thinking and being. How have Enlightenment ideals shaped what is considered legitimate knowledge in schools today? The history of Canada is deeply intertwined with the history, perspectives, and ongoing experiences of Indigenous peoples, who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. A comprehensive account of how Canada came to be is therefore not complete without understanding how Britain and France's relationships with Indigenous peoples went from a partnership to trade, then to resource extraction, and then colonization. Canadian education was a direct tool of assimilation in order to eradicate opposition. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1920. This quote reminds us of the explicit goal of cultural eradication embedded in the Canadian educational lineage. You've heard about residential schools, probably many times, but who was telling the stories? Residential schools are perhaps the most widely known aspect of Indigenous history in Canada. However, the history of residential schools is generally presented from the perspective of the Canadian government and settlers. While truth is necessary for reconciliation, how do stories of Indigenous oppression and suffering affect perceptions of Indigenous people today? Consider then, whose story do we foreground, even in attempts to undo past wrongs? Colonial ideologies have got in the way of schooling practices and have shaped the way schools work today. Most school lessons and teaching styles still reflect a colonial mindset, which is based on ignoring or breaking relationships, especially with land, culture, and people. Over time, this has led to school practices that continue to quietly ignore these relationships without question. Many Indigenous students carry the effects of trauma passed down through generations, which can impact how they feel, behave, and take part in class in the sense that prevailing curricular and pedagogical approaches perpetuate colonial worldview. Reflect on where these approaches remain present in your teaching context. Many Indigenous families don't trust schools or government systems, and with good reason, based on past and present experiences. In the classroom, Indigenous students rarely see their own cultures or stories represented in books, videos, or lessons. In the school environment, as well as other institutions, there are still major barriers and unfair systems in place, so that even when individuals try hard to make change, the bigger system can push back. Unless we make a real effort to change things, the same harmful power structures will keep repeating themselves in quiet but powerful ways. To be clearer and more explicit, within schools, Indigenous students do not see themselves represented in typical classroom readings, videos, or stories. Intergenerational trauma affects students' well-being, attitudes, and classroom engagement. Institutionally, many families have evidence-based distrust of educational and government institutions. Systematically. Systemic barriers and inequities persist. Even the best individual effort will meet opposition from larger structures of oppression. Keep these three interconnected levels in mind as you reflect. Take a moment to reflect on these two prompts. If your school has an Indigenous population, consider how your school treats students from this identity who seem disengaged, disconnected, or uninterested. If it does not, consider how the narratives of cause, effect, and impact have been shaped for versus by Indigenous students and communities. Without intentional intervention, colonial power dynamics are easily reproduced in subtle but significant ways. Pause now to consider these ideas and write down your reflections. Colonialism isn't just something that happened in the past. It's still built into many of the attitudes, habits, and systems we accept as normal in Canada. These ideas often run in the background of our thinking without us realizing it. Hence the use of the term implicit bias. So what are some things we can do? Notice and do. We must take time and care to notice exclusionary practices so we can do something about it. But we also need to know what to look for. Remember that colonialism is not just historical, but continues today. As we continue, keep noticing where colonial assumptions remain invisible but powerful. We now explore the concept of cognitive imperialism. Cognitive imperialism, the imposition of one worldview on a people who have an alternative worldview, with the implication that the imposed worldview is superior to the alternative worldview. The colonial education system sought to both enforce a dominant, Eurocentric worldview while at the same time devalue and exclude alternative knowledge systems, especially Indigenous ways of knowing. In Canada, this looks like Eurocentric knowledge and education being advanced at the expense of Indigenous knowledges being rendered as unimportant, unrealistic, passé, and invisible. This is because Eurocentric education presents only one way of thinking, one way of being, and one way of viewing the world. Reflect on how cognitive imperialism shows up in your own teaching and curricula choices. We continue examining how Eurocentric ideologies are reinforced in schools. Eurocentric ideologies are being reinforced in the Canadian educational system. Individualism, competition, meritocracy, singular truths, anthropocentrism, unidirectional learning, i.e. teacher-educator to teacher to student, and disciplinary boundaries. There is a safeguarding of Eurocentric content and values through hierarchical and competitive relationships, and through the very ways of thinking about what constitutes knowledge, education, and success. These have become objects one acquires rather than lifelong processes that are subjective for each person. Anthropocentrism means viewing humans as more important than other life forms. Consider how this framing influences your teaching, and how it might be in direct contradiction to Indigenous worldviews. This concept is expanded further with practical manifestations. Most education in Canada is based on a straight-line view of time. It focuses on rigid structures, dividing knowledge into narrow specialties, studying things separately from their real-life context, and valuing numbers and logic more than relationships and connections. Schools often manifest the colonial mindset by sticking to a set curriculum, treating teachers as the main and unquestionable source of knowledge, and arranging classrooms in rigid ways, i.e. tight rows of desks make it hard to try different, more open ways of learning, like group discussions or circle-based activities. These constructs of these are well established, making change difficult at a school and societal level. Pressures on time and resources, as well as the school's own culture, combined with a lack of support for new approaches to act as a dissuasive barriers to moving away from the status quo. Notice how these structures might limit relational, experiential learning in your classroom. Here we see how these structures condition Indigenous students within schools. The systemic and meticulous setup can condition Indigenous students to a state of inferiorization and colonization. It teaches the language, literature, and history of the colonizer while forcing students to deny their language, culture, and essential being. The next slide invites us to question these dominant educational structures. Consider these final reflection questions for this section. Consider what questions might be arising in the way schools have been designed in their setup. Is there only one right way to teach and learn, particularly in FSL? How might this setup have been harming or excluding Indigenous students and ways of knowing? Pause here to write down your answers before we continue into the next module section. Learning about Indigenous peoples and perspectives on Turtle Island, Module 2. So far we've learned about implicit bias and unlearning, the legacy of colonialism in education, and now this section is undoing and reimagining. So where are we now? How do we, as human beings, take steps towards unlearning and undoing said behaviors, beliefs, and often false truths? We haven't reached our imagined destination, but things have improved. Inclusion doesn't happen by accident. Cultural and system shifts take work. Recognizing that there is more beyond our field of vision is the first step. Decentering, denaturalizing, and unlearning colonial logics of relationship denial as curricular and pedagogical common sense. Then, we must learn to honor other ways to know and be. How can you imagine doing this in your own practice, in your own classrooms, and as an educator? What is ethnocentrism? When we say it's not wrong, just different, while unconsciously believing our way makes more sense, we subscribe to ethnocentrism. We center our own ethnicity, assuming a group's norms are universal standards that other cultures should measure up against. Please consider, is written knowledge more true than oral traditions? Is time linear or cyclical? Which is more important, personal success or collective advancement? The Bennett scale describes a continuum of attitudes towards other belief systems. Even when we are consciously working to minimize prejudice, an honest self-assessment may show that our work is unfinished. About or from? The phrase, we should learn about other cultures, often leads to heroes and holidays approach. Focusing on surface-level learning about food, festivals, and famous figures. Learning about a culture can reinforce stereotypes as it positions the learner's cultures as the norm, observing the exotic other culture. It can also focus on visible elements of culture, resulting in a lack of understanding or underlying value in knowledge systems. Instead, authentic integration requires learning from Indigenous perspectives, valuing their knowledge, and incorporating it meaningfully. This requires an understanding and belief in the value of that perspective. Take a moment to think about how you might learn about other cultures in your classroom, and what way may you decenter this in order to engage in authentic relationships and relationality with your students. Using feel-good or so-called neutral language in place of truth-telling creates an environment where we cover up uncomfortable realities with positivity. This makes it harder to recognize and address unfair systems. Unhelpful phrases like, "I don't see color," or "we're all just human," and "everyone is entitled to their opinion," may sound kind of fair on the surface, but they can actually cause harm in conversations about equity and justice. These expressions often shut down deeper dialogue by ignoring the realities of racism, systemic injustice, and cultural identity. They suggest that treating everyone the same is enough, when in fact people are treated very differently based on race, culture, and power. Consider how you have come to understand fairness, the idea that it isn't about treating everyone exactly the same. It's about meeting people where they are and responding to their real needs and experiences, and how you reflect this to the classes you teach. When Indigenous ways of knowing are centered in education, all students benefit from stronger cultural connection and healing for Indigenous learners to deeper, more relational thinking skills for everyone. For Indigenous students see their cultures, languages, and histories given value and attention in the classroom. Their learning is connected to identity, community, and the land-building whole people, not future employees. Students feel understood, safe, and capable of success. Educational institutions are a source of cultural pride and healing. This is the way that it could be. But how is it now? For all students, decolonized education benefits all students, Indigenous and settler. Our world demands greater understanding of relationships, complex networks of connections, and ability to hold multiple perspectives. Indigenous education develops thinkers and collaborators. Our curriculum could explicitly include empathy, balance, systems thinking, and intercultural skills. This is the way it could be. How do you see it happening now? Take a moment to reflect if the curricula that you teach exposes some of these ideologies and worldviews to help benefit our Indigenous students as well as all students. Learning about Indigenous peoples and perspectives on Turtle Island, Module 2. We have learned about implicit bias and unlearning, the legacy of colonialism in education, undoing and reimagining, and now we're going to talk about indigenizing education. Indigenizing education requires an understanding of Indigenous pedagogies and appreciation for their benefits. Indigenous pedagogies offer holistic, relational, and experiential approaches that are valuable for all learners. These are not alternative methods, but effective, time-tested ways of teaching and learning that help to navigate complexity and contextualize knowledge. Like other forms of inclusion, incorporating Indigenous pedagogies and practices has benefits for all learners. Reflect on how these pedagogies might challenge or complement your teaching practice. Many students of all backgrounds struggle with the rigid expectations of typical Canadian schools, and Indigenous pedagogy offers a model for complex systems thinking and holding nuanced, unresolved thoughts. Indigenous ways of teaching naturally integrate multiple modes of learning and expression, making differentiation natural and not additional. Learning is lifelong, experiential, and engages mind, body, and spirit, and does not attempt to separate intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and physical realms. Teaching is inherently project-based and might involve physical activities or skills, spiritual and cultural storytelling, personal conversation and reflection, and intellectual inquiry related to a single theme. Progress is cyclical and spiral-shaped, leading to deeper understandings with each return to the theme. Measurable skills must be considered together with philosophical understandings. There are multiple modes of understanding and showing understanding. None is more important or valuable than the others, and all are necessary to accurately know a person's understanding. Does this sound like a classroom you'd like to be a part of? Indigenous knowledge is not just cultural, but also informs process and learning design. Indigenous knowledge is a unique body of knowledge held by Indigenous peoples, accumulated over generations through their close relationship with their traditional territories and resources. It encompasses cultural, environmental, economic, health, political, and spiritual interrelationships and is deeply connected to language, perspectives, and worldviews. Key characteristics of Indigenous knowledge. It's holistic. It views the world as interconnected with relationships between people, land, plants, animals, and the spiritual realm. Traditional and contemporary. It is based on historical experiences, but it is also dynamic and adapts to change. Oral transmission, often passed down through generations through stories, ceremonies, and practices. It's practical and experiential, rooted in direct observation and experience of the natural world. Value-based, it's guided by principles of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility toward the land and all living things. Reflect on how these characteristics contrast with dominant Western educational models found in the curriculum you're familiar with. How does this make you feel? What do you think about? When learning takes place on and with the land, students connect knowledge to place, community, and relationship, shifting from using the land as a resource to respecting it as a teacher. It is a source of knowledge, identity, spirituality, and well-being, not a resource to be used. It is our relative. It is place-based, which has immediate ecosystems, stories, and traditional knowledges of that place. It is also experiential. It's a whole-body observation, consideration, action, as well as a relationship that is continuously being built upon. Many types of learning can happen on the land. Language and literacy, math, science, and traditional knowledge can coexist. Instead of reading about ecosystems, students go outside to observe local plants and animals, learn their names, and see how and where they grow together, and hear their stories related to them. They learn about traditional medicines. They can see how these relatives of ours, our plant relatives, contribute to a holistic understanding of our ecosystem and our relationship with the land. Next, we introduce the concept of two-eyed seeing. Eduaptamak, or two-eyed seeing, invites us to hold both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems side by side, valuing the strength of each without blending or erasing either for the benefit of all. Concept taught by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. It values both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems without assimilation, thus holding both perspectives at the same time and valuing both ways of seeing. Learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. A classroom example could be teaching French grammar within the format of Indigenous storytelling structures. How could two-eyed seeing inform your lesson design or classroom structure? What if you want to invite Indigenous knowledge keepers into your space or classroom? There are elements that you may not have considered. Welcoming Indigenous knowledge keepers into our schools calls for more than an invitation. It requires thoughtful attention to space, protocol, and power, so their presence is honored and their teachings are respected. When inviting Indigenous colleagues, elders, or community members, notice colonial structures and symbols that may exist in your space and prepare to decolonize them wherever possible. Consider these examples and suggestions. Do visitors typically need to sign in? This is depersonalizing and breaks relationships just as you've welcomed a guest. Instead, register them in advance so that you can proceed directly to the teaching space. Is your classroom the best place to share and hold Indigenous knowledge? Consider where else in your school and how else spaces in your school can be used to share and hold knowledge, including outdoor areas. Have you prepared in advance to navigate purchasing items to offer protocol and honoraria? Ensuring that bureaucratic issues are resolved in advance of the visit helps to position Indigenous protocol in the foreground and be the most visible. How might you position yourself as a learner as well? Being open to listening for ways to change your practice as a result of the teachings you receive is as important as the learning you hope for others. Have you asked for permission to share what has been taught? Arranging another visit might be preferred to sharing information on behalf of an invited guest, so it's important to ask their preference. How can both in advance and in the moment encourage non-Indigenous staff and students to participate in events? Balancing a desire to not intrude can also create subtle narratives of exclusion and marginalization. Consider asking the host who is welcome to participate, and then normalize extending invitations just as you would for any other school or community event. Also reflect on these questions after hosting Indigenous guests and make notes for the future. Give your students time to reflect on the learnings and teachings that they have encountered as well. If you do not know an elder or knowledge keeper that you can invite into your school or classroom, find out who you can contact to make this connection. Ask the contact if the elder or knowledge keeper prefers to be contacted by that person, or if they don't mind other people contacting them. Be mindful that some prefer to keep contact information private. Always offer a gift or honorarium to our elders and knowledge keepers, and ensure you ask them what their preference is so it is ready for them when they visit your school or classroom. We offer gifts and tobacco to our elders as an exchange for the knowledge and stories that they hold. This is a traditional protocol that is followed across Turtle Island as a respectful form of reciprocity in exchange for what they are bringing to us. Depending on the preference of gifts or honorariums, keep in mind some elders or knowledge keepers may prefer to be paid or gifted per hour, per half day or full day, for example, $125 a half day, or $250 per day, or $300 per day when out on the land. Based on the number of classes they visit, sometimes based on specialty of subject or topic. Again, always offer a gift or honorarium and ensure you ask them what their preference is so it is ready for them when they visit. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It requires action. Decolonization doesn't just happen on its own. Colonial systems are deeply rooted and tend to repeat themselves unless people actively work to change them. Time alone won't fix things. People who hold power, especially settlers and groups accepted by the colonial norms, have a responsibility to create space for others and remove unfair barriers. The hard truth is that colonial thinking isn't just an academic issue. When people see the colonial worldview as normal, or just common sense, they learn to see the world in divided and disconnected ways. In education, this way of thinking has become so dominant that it's hard to take others' ways of knowing or being seriously. But this inability to respect and learn from other knowledge systems is part of what's causing harm we see today, like division, inequality, and damage to the planet. What's one small step you can immediately take to decolonize your classroom? We now conclude with decolonization. As we come to the end of this module, consider now the meaning of the phrase, "We are all treaty people," and reflect on your own positionality. Consider, with intention, one or two of the following prompts. How is the status quo of FSL education shaped by colonial values, such as prioritizing European languages, emphasizing standardized grammar, or disconnecting language learning from land and identity? How can you make this status quo awkward in your classroom, your team, or your curriculum planning conversations? What would it look like to teach French through a two-eyed seeing lens? For example, exploring French grammar within Indigenous narrative forms or stories rooted in local land or context. How can you remain accountable to the Indigenous teachings and protocols, especially when inviting elders or knowledge keepers into your FSL space?
Listed are a variety of sources and appendices that have invaluable information and resources that you may also check out for further information. Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey by clicking on the link or scanning the QR code. Should you have any questions about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a nonprofit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international language teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. Special thanks to the educators who contributed their expertise and the experience to the development of these modules.